right, let's dive into Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. We got excerpts from chapters 38 to 43. Some interesting visuals, too. Spiders, gentlemen, ladies going about their business. I'm already picking up some serious social commentary vibes here.
Austen was amazing at that. Weaving in those complex social dynamics, you think it's a simple story or romance, and suddenly, bam, you're thinking about class, family, and the weight of expectations.
Okay, you've got me hooked. So let's unpack some of these themes. And I guess the most obvious place to start is right there in the title, Pride and Prejudice. How do they actually show up in these chapters? And what do you think Austen's trying to tell us?
Well, you can't talk about Pride without talking about Mr. Collins, right? He's practically tripping over his own ego, boasting about Lady Catherine. But it's not just him being vain. Austen uses him to show us something about pride in 19th century England. It was all tied up with social standing, even a flimsy connection to someone like Lady Catherine. Well, in his mind, at least, it elevated him, and sat was others bought into it too.
It's tough to watch him practically fawn over her. And it makes you think, is Austen saying that pride back then wasn't really about what you'd actually achieved, but more about clinging to whatever social markers you could get?
Exactly. Now think about Elizabeth. She starts off prejudiced against Darcy because of Wickham's buys. But her prejudice is coming from a different place. It's about justice, protecting her family. Still, it blinds her to Darcy's real character, and it highlights how easily prejudice can mess with your judgment, even someone as sharp as Elizabeth.
So you're saying both Pride and Prejudice can distort how we see things and lead us to make bad choices, no matter how smart or well-intentioned we might be.
Absolutely, and that's what makes Austen's characters so relatable. Even centuries later, we all struggle with these flaws, right? And seeing them play out in Pride and Prejudice, it gives us this nuanced look at what it means to be human.
Okay, so Pride and Prejudice are definitely biggies, but you mentioned societal commentary. What about this theme of class and social mobility, especially with all this about Lydia and Brighton?
Oh, huge. For Austen's characters, Brighton was like this magnet. If you wanted to climb the social ladder, it was the place to see and be seen. And maybe, just maybe, land a good marriage.
Wood is practically drooling over all the officers.
Right. And her obsession with them, it's not just about attraction. She wants to elevate herself. Marrying an officer, even someone like Wickham with his shady reputation, at least in her mind, it would boost her social standing.
But then you have Elizabeth. She flat out rejects Darcy's first proposal. And he's got the wealth and status, the whole package. Why do you think Austen sets up that contrast?
It's so clever. She uses Elizabeth to flip the script, to challenge what society was telling women back then. Elizabeth is saying, look, true worth isn't about your social standing. It's about character, intellectual connection, genuine respect. Those things may matter more than your class.
It's pretty refreshing, even for us today. It's like she's saying, forget your fancy titles and estates. I want a partner who challenges me and respects me.
Exactly. And by refusing to compromise, she highlights how limited women's options were back then. You were expected to marry well for financial security, but Elizabeth, she dares to choose love and intellectual connection over what society expects of her.
It must have taken guts, especially in a world where a woman's entire future depended on finding the right husband. Which brings us to another massive theme, family and marriage. It's almost suffocating how much it dominates these characters' lives.
It's inescapable, isn't it? Mrs. Bennet is like this walking, talking embodiment of that pressure, fixated on marrying off her daughters. But there's something both funny and kind of tragic about her desperation. She really shows us how few choices women had back then.
And then there's Charlotte Lucas, marrying Mr. Collins for purely practical reasons.
It's heartbreaking, but it felt so real. Austen doesn't shy away from the tough realities women faced. Unlike Elizabeth, Charlotte chooses security over romantic love. It's a decision a lot of women were forced to make.
It makes you wonder, how much of their personalities were shaped by all those societal pressures? Were they really themselves? Or were they just performing the roles that society assigned to them based on their gender and class?
That's a great question, and it gets at what makes Austen so brilliant. She creates these complex characters, leaving room for interpretation. Are they trapped by their circumstances, or are they making choices, even within a limited set of options? It's up to the reader to decide.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. We've barely scratched the surface. And I'm already seeing these characters and themes in a whole new light.
We're just getting started. Wait till we dig into Austen's language, those witty lines, the way she reveals so much about the characters through these tiny little observations. That's where her brilliance really shines.
All right, bring on the brilliance. I'm ready for more. Okay, let's talk about Austen's language. We've talked about the big ideas, but it's how she writes, right? That's what makes it so captivating. So where do we even begin?
Good question. Let's focus on two characters. Two who really show off Austen's skill, Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. Their journeys are all tangled up with those themes we talked about, but it's their individual voices. That's what pulls us in.
Elizabeth first, obviously. Let's be real, she's the star of the show. What makes her so relatable, even for us modern readers?
It's how Austen lets us in on her thoughts, through a technique called free indirect discourse. We hear her witty little comments in her head, alongside the actual dialogue. It makes her feel so real, so human.
Oh, you mean like when she calls Mr. Collins' proposal an aggravation back in chapter 19? It's hilarious, but also it tells us so much about her sharp mind, strong opinions.
Exactly. Austen doesn't just tell us Elizabeth is smart and independent. She shows us through Elizabeth's own voice. And that voice is witty, yeah, often satirical, but it's also capable of deep feeling.
It's like we're right there with her, experiencing all that social awkwardness, the frustrations, the little moments of attraction.
Precisely, and that intimacy makes her flaws. Like her initial prejudice against Darcy makes them understandable. We see how Wickham's charm and her own pride cloud her judgment.
But she does grow, right? She learns from those mistakes, which makes her even more interesting as a character.
Absolutely, and her language reflects that growth. As she starts to see Darcy for who he really is, her inner voice becomes less judgmental, more open to the nuances.
Okay, so Elizabeth is all about wit and changing her mind. What about Mr. Darcy? He's so reserved at first, almost brooding. How does Austen use language to reveal his character?
Now that's interesting. Darcy is often defined by what other people say about him, rather than what he says himself. Think about all those rumors swirling around. Proud, aloof, arrogant even.
And those rumors totally shape Elizabeth's view of him, and the readers too. But then we get these glimpses of a different Darcy, especially at Pemberley.
That's the turning point. The housekeeper describes Darcy as kind and generous. It completely contradicts everything we've heard before. It's like Austen is playing with our expectations.
It makes us question those initial judgments, just like Elizabeth does. But Darcy himself is still pretty reserved, even when he's being nice. How does Austen show us his deeper emotions?
Through subtle cues, his actions speak louder than his words. Like when he intervenes with Lydia and Wickham, that's huge. It shows his sense of honor, responsibility, even towards a family he doesn't really like.
It's like he's got the strong moral compass, but he doesn't know how to express it directly. He's more of a doer than a talker.
Exactly, and that contrast with Elizabeth, who's so much more expressive, it's what makes their dynamic so interesting. They challenge each other, they balance each other out.
Okay, so we've got these two complex characters, revealed through completely different styles of language. But what about those visuals we mentioned? How do they fit into all this?
They add another layer, right? A layer of symbolism and interpretation. That spider web, for instance, it could represent the intricate social webs. Austen is so good at portraying everyone's connected, actions have consequences. It's all about this delicate balance.
I see it, those invisible threads of reputation, expectation, binding all these characters together, often limiting their choices.
Exactly. And the gentlemen and ladies, they could represent the rigid gender roles back then. The gentleman standing tall and confident, the embodiment of patriarchal authority, and the ladies, busy with domestic tasks, they highlight the limitations placed on women.
But even with those limitations, Elizabeth finds ways to push back. She challenges those expectations, even if it means risking social disapproval.
And that's what makes her such a powerful character. Austen isn't calling for a revolution, but she's subtly critiquing the system by showing us a woman who dares to think for herself.
Okay, I'm getting chills. This is so much more than just a romance. It's commentary on society, on gender, on the struggle to be yourself.
And Austen does it all with such wit and grace. She never preaches, but she makes you think. That's the magic of her writing.
Okay, so we've got themes, characters, language, these thought-provoking visuals. But what's the takeaway? Why should we care about a book written centuries ago?
Because Austen is tapping into something timeless. Timeless truths about human nature. Pride, prejudice, wanting to connect with others, the struggle against what society tells us to be. These are universal experiences. They resonate across time and cultures.
So Pride and Prejudice, it's more than just a delightful romance.
It's a mirror reflecting our own complexities, a reminder that judging by appearances can be dangerous, and that real growth comes from challenging our own biases and embracing a wider perspective.
Yeah, it's like she's holding up this perfectly crafted mirror, showing us all our flaws, but also our potential to grow. And she does it with such wit, such subtlety. It's not about lecturing us. It's about making us really think.
Exactly. And that's where those visual clues we talked about, they get even more interesting. They're not just symbols of what's happening in the story. They could also be metaphors for us as readers, our own journey through the book.
Okay, now you've really got me intrigued. A spider web and some figures from the 1800s. How did those represent my experience reading Pride and Prejudice?
Think about it. That gentleman standing there all confident, He could represent the omniscience we bring as readers. We walk into the story with certain ideas about romance, about the characters, even about Austen herself.
And those assumptions, kind of like that gentleman, could be a bit rigid, right? Not very open to new information.
Precisely. But as we read, as we start to see things from Elizabeth's point of view, those assumptions start to unravel. Just like that spider web.
We see the cracks in those first impressions, the nuances of the characters that don't fit into neat little boxes. We become less like that stiff gentleman and more like, well, more like Elizabeth, I guess. Open to change, to complexity.
Exactly. And those ladies, busy with their domestic tasks, they could represent the deeper layers we uncover as we read. The seemingly ordinary stuff, tending a fire, writing a letter. In Austen's hands, those become charged with emotion and meaning.
It's like those everyday scenes are where the real drama is unfolding. The unspoken desires, the power dynamics, it's all simmering beneath the surface.
And as we keep reading, we become more attuned to those subtleties. We learn to read between the lines, to pick up on the weight of a glance, a carefully chosen word.
So it's not just about what's happening in the story. It's about how we, as readers, experience it. We start with one perspective, one set of assumptions. And through Austen's masterful storytelling, we're led to a more nuanced, more complex understanding.
That's a great way to put it. It really is a literary dance. Austen leads, but she gives us space to interpret, to connect, to find our own meaning within the world she's created.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I've not only revisited a favorite book, but discovered a whole new level of appreciation for Austen's genius.
That's the beauty of Austen. There's always more to discover. Every time you reread it, you find new insights, new connections, new ways to challenge your own perspective.
So as we wrap up, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this deep dive into Pride and Prejudice?
That's a good question. I hope they'll be inspired to approach all stories, maybe even life itself, with a little bit of Elizabeth's spirit, a healthy dose of skepticism, a willingness to question assumptions, and an open heart ready to be surprised.
Beautifully said. And maybe, just maybe, they'll find their own Mr. Darcy along the way. Or even better, become their own Elizabeth Bennet.
Now that's a goal worth striving for. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those pages turning and those minds exploring.